Hello and welcome to a new video. In today's session, we are going to introduce architecture modeling language ArchiMate. This is a complementary tool to the OpenGroup TOGAF standard for architecture, or the ADM, Architecture Development Method, and integrates well with the ADM steps, as you can see in the diagram on the screen. And also you can infer from the diagram at which step of the ADM you can use which set of tools and annotations from the ArchiMate. So we will go through the ArchiMate tool, the resources that are available on the OpenGroup library, and then I'll introduce the Archi, which is an open source tool that implements the ArchiMate standard, and then I'll start by introducing the first layer, or the motivation layer, and we'll see how we can use it with a simple case study to introduce the tool to begin with. So the PDF on the screen, you can easily get it from the OpenGroup library. For the sake of completeness, I will go there and show you where you can find the relevant resources. If you go on the opengroup.org and then on library, you can see the ArchiMate library. And over here you can find a decent number of resources available mostly for free that you can use to get started with the tool. Be aware that this ArchiMate specification is ArchiMate version 4, and it was preceded of course with version 3. That version 4 has just come out very recently, and if you are going to do the certification, I can always recommend going with the most recent version, and surely it addresses topics like cloud architecture modeling and even artificial intelligence, or AI. Once you can have any of the resources, you can have click on view product, and then you add to downloads, agree to the license agreement. You will be redirected to your downloadable products. You can see here I've got a few of them related to TOGAF, ArchiMate, so on and so forth. And next step, we introduce Archi. And the Archi itself, this is the tool that you can use to start playing around with the ArchiMate standard. You can download it from archimatetool.com. Download. I've already done that so that I don't have to do that again. You can see it's available for Linux, Windows and Mac. I will open my own version. Now the question, where did I have it saved? Perhaps somewhere in downloads. So I have it installed quite a few times. I'll try again with version 5.9. So perhaps it's a good time to start adding a shortcut to the desktop so I don't have to start searching for it again. You can see here one of the models I was just playing around for an MCP server for AI. Well, this is how it looks like. To begin with, you have the different layers, the elements arranged in them so that you can easily reuse the elements. If you add one element in one diagram and you rename it, for example, you don't have to look for it in every view you have in your views directory and rename it separately. Once you rename it once, then it will be saved in the relevant architecture layer, strategy, business application, motivation, etc. This is one of the advantages of this tool. On the right hand side, you have all of the tool sets that you can use for the modeling. Again, the colors and the separators indicate different layers of the ArchiMate modeling standard, relevant also to corresponding to the TOGAF standard. I'll start now with a new empty model. I will rename it ArchiMate Introduction. I'll close the older one. You can see an empty model has only a default view, which is also again empty, and all of the layers are empty. So I'll start now with adding a new ArchiMate view. I'll call it motivation layer, and in this example, a use case, I will assume that we have a I'll assume that we have an online store, and this online store aims at increasing its sales, and to increase their sales, they're investigating few options and they are trying to see the trade-offs and risk associated with each option and how this affects the overall enterprise strategy. So the tools that I will need for this analysis, they are listed on the right side in the purple color. So begin with, we have a stakeholder. This could be an department, it could be a role, could be a person or an actor. And then we have the second element is the driver. This is the motivation. What is the driver? What is the motivation behind a specific action or a specific requirement? And then we have a metric. How are we going to assess or measure the success of this goal or outcome? Then we have a goal. This is what we are trying to achieve. It could be increase sales, increase retention, a decrease cloud cost. However, the strategy for our enterprise is laid out. And then we have an outcome. This is a concrete outcome, specific outcome from a specific action that we are taking. Then here we have a principle. This is one of the restrictions or of a principle is simply the guideline or the way that we do things. For example, in principle, we always use open source tools, or in principle, we prefer nearly geolocated service providers, or we have a principle that we use only fair trade products in our enterprise. And then we have a requirement. This is a requirement that results from laying out our drivers, outcomes, and goals. And then there is a constraint on that requirement. Again, a constraint is a way of strictly specifying the requirement, again in the direction of being user friendly. It should be accessibility guidelines. If we are using PDFs or we are using online accessible forms, then we can even specify that this should be with all accessibility guidelines so that it's easily readable for people with different restrictions on accessing such tools away from the normal way of accessing these tools. There is a correct term for this. People with people with people with different restrictions or disabilities affecting them from accessing our tools. A better example will come on the way as we dive in the use case. And right here we have a meaning, and a meaning can be associated with any element. This is to explain the kind of a note or a documentation on the tool that we have. And the last tool that we have here is a value. Why we are doing this? What is the value of doing this? Is this a revenue, increase in revenue? Is this a better reputation? Is this potential new markets, international markets? However we align this. Interesting is that when we look at these tools, we need to connect them, of course, with connectors. There are a few connectors and each has its own meaning, and there is this magic connector. The magic connector allows you not to memorize every single connector in the standard, because some connectors are disallowed by the standard between some elements, because on one hand it doesn't make much sense, or on the other hand it is seen like that by the creators of the standard, so that they can have it more opinionated and interpretable, understood by every organization, or even to be generic and applied for different industries. So in this example, we'll start with the stakeholders. And as you can see in this use case, who could be the stakeholders? We could have here our sales team. Of course, they want to increase their revenue as much as possible, acquiring new leads, etc. And then we have another stakeholder who could be the operations team, who have a different requirement. It could be they require much user-friendly tools, better connectivity, better standardized ways or methods and processes in the enterprise. And then let's map the drivers to these different stakeholders. So this driver will say in this increased sales driver aligns with the sales team, and we add another driver, standard standardize processes. This is aligned with the operation team. Now let's connect them together with the magic one, because associated will be the most relevant connector here. Again, associated to. And then we see what are the goals associated with increased sales. So as a goal, we'll say higher revenue, and another goal in standardizing the processes is that we have higher productivity. And again, how they are related to each other. So an association process. Then comes next, how are we going to measure the success of each goal? So higher revenue, this is measured in return on investment, sales, this is a dollar value. And how we are measuring the productivity, we measure number of orders per time unit, let's say per working day. And then related to the goal, one of the interesting things, what is relationship between these two branches of our motivation? So how is the higher revenue affected by the higher productivity? So we think about it, is this a positive or negative relation? I would say higher productivity influence positively the revenue, because we can process more orders in a time unit, so we definitely contribute positively to this outcome or goal. Of course, when you look at the diagram now, you think perhaps we should have chosen better names for our drivers. So perhaps increased sales could be competition from the other markets, or new competitor arriving in the market. Operations team standardized processes as driver. I think this is adequate as a naming. Of course, the more specific the use case, the better the naming will be. And usually these diagrams, you just don't draw them in a silo from the rest of the architecture team, but it comes out of brainstorming, workshops, and many sessions and iterations of elaboration until you arrive one view or more than one view that is agreed on by the different stakeholders and interested parties in the organization. So what principles are guiding us through the process, and what is the different requirements that will come out of these goals that we have set? So let's start with having few principles that are guiding our flow here. So for high productivity, we maintain work life balance. So even though we are encouraging our employees to have to be more productive, we don't let the work-life balance out of the equation. Again, how this is related to our goal is an association. Of course, you can see here now we start to have realization. Realization is when you have an action or a component or a service that realizes a goal, or a work package in the implementation layer that realizes one of these goals. It would be interesting to map the implementation and work packages to the motivation layer. This again one of the chapters in the ArchiMate pocket guide on the open group library. Can definitely recommend referring to it. At this moment I will stay with the association, and on the other hand the higher revenue is restricted with our principles of having high quality products, or let's say high customer satisfaction. Alright, so it's good time to rearrange our diagram a little bit. Align it to the center of the screen a bit more, and again an association will do for this purpose. So we have mapped now principles to our goals. We start now with specifying some requirements that come out from fulfilling these goals. So a requirement for higher productivity would be a reliable CRM. It could be having a warehouse management system or ERP system, we say robust ERP with warehouse tools, etc. For higher sales, what could be the requirement to increase our revenue? We need to have a proper customer segmentation or analytics, dashboards. We need to KYC, perhaps we name it better, improved if it doesn't exist, or new KYC tools. And to increase the sales, of course, we need connection with the reliable CRM, or we can now have one of the constraints on our CRM that it should support social media. Now this is a good constraint. Marketing channels. So if we are active, our customers are on teenagers on TikTok or another medium, then our CRM should integrate well with this medium. So you can see now how it starts to build up, and we have a quite rich set of tools to represent all of the cases that we are having here in this example use case, but also in the real world I have tried a few scenarios and a few use cases in practice, and the tools and the set of annotations available here in ArchiMate or Archi tool, they have been quite sufficient to represent a wide set of architecture modeling requirements. So we'll start now with mapping these requirements and constraints to the goals they are representing. That's another good chance to start rearranging our diagram a bit more and aligning it a little bit to the top. And then our matrix. So this is one of the caveats of this tool, this how the alignment of the lines is not quite as smooth, but you come here over the tooltip of the line and then you can rearrange it as to look a little bit more professionalized. I will do the same here. Again, the same constraint. Of course, if you have Spark's Enterprise Architect, it should be even more robust and versatile in terms of these alignments. So the new KYC tools, they should help us with higher revenue and the productivity. Let's align them with the goal. It should be a realize relation, because this is how we realize these goals. A reliable CRM, it realizes both tools, both goals. Of course, you can go directly to realize. You can see dotted with an empty arrow at the end. You can find it on the right. For the sake of example, let's just do it once. So this realizes both goals. Again, a little bit of alignment doesn't hurt. And then social media. This is a constraint on a reliable CRM, customer management. And interesting, the relationship between the constraint and the requirement. This is going to be very interesting because here we have a few more options. Is this a composition? A composition and aggregation, they are quite different, because this says that this requirement is composed of some constraints. This is not what we are trying to say. And aggregation is different from composition in that the aggregation allows the sub items to exist on their own. It could be a component that allows integration with TikTok that can exist on its own even without the CRM. So this here, the distinction between the different annotations is quite important, and it also gives a clue what kind of requirement and details of the architecture will result from just a very small change in the annotation. And definitely it is not an influence, because this restriction is not influencing the requirement. More likely it is a specialization. So not even that. I would even undo this statement. I'll say specialization is when you have a special case of a more generic situation. In this case, I would say let's revisit the reference. A good point to see an exercise where the reference can help us find out which relation is more appropriate between the restriction and the constraint and the requirement. So I believe we still have that open on the screen, and I'll navigate here to the motivation layer. Goal, outcome, principle, and requirement, meaning and value. Let's hope there is one example. A goal and outcome, a principle, a requirement, and here we have an example again with realization of the principles or realization of the outcomes. Here we have the relation of meaning and value, and I'm interested now in the constraint. Stakeholder assessment, principle, requirement, meaning. It looks like quite interesting in this ArchiMate Standard 4 edition. It looks even more interesting that I cannot find the constraint anymore, and I have a doubt that it has been removed in version 4 from version 3. It's quite the case here. So constraint can be a specialization of a requirement. Can easily be to the new version by applying the following transformation. The constraint can be a specialization of a requirement. So this update from version 3.2 to version 4, which has come out recently, says that constraints now are a specialization of a requirement. Subsequently, I assume that in version 3.2 they were also a specialization in relation to the requirement. Of course, in our example use case, it suffices here if we stick with a specialization relation here from the box, and this should do quite well for the sake of example. It's also good to know how the standard changes, and one should always keep an eye on the official documentation and change log just in case. Now back to our rest of the requirements, and then we can see here a robust enterprise platform or ERP system, and again this realization in relation to a higher productivity. So this now shows quite a comprehensive view of this use case. For the sake of experimentation and introducing the rest of the tools, I will use here a meaning. So perhaps it should be explained what is a robust ERP. That's what we said, the warehouse module should be available. Not only available, it should be quite functional enough so that we can actually make use of it, and the relationship between a requirement and meaning is association. You also check out which are all of the available relations is influence or association. Here I would say association is more correct. And one more thing we can try is the value. What is the value this thing brings? What is the value a robust ERP brings? So a robust ERP brings with it reduced order processing time. And again, let's say this should be an association relation to the requirement. We can do it here on the side or a little bit more to the side. Again, this caveat of the tool. One of the things that are quite annoying in the open source version, so to say. But at least here we have a comprehensive set of a motivation layer. So this now can be complemented with a grouping You can see here there is a generic group visual grouping element, there is a legend, there is a note, and a connection. We can start with adding a legend. You can see here automatically filled. So we have here assessment, constraint, driver, influence relation, so that you don't have to explain this to someone who is not quite as well informed about the standard as you are. We can add a package to make things look okayish. Resize it, and then send it to the background. Now you can see all my elements are there. I'll map them so that they can fit inside the package or the group. Now we can this group brainstorming session of 2026 17th 19th of July. I'll fit it on the screen. You can see the entire diagram. Save it. Finally, I can export it as an image. Once it's exported, you have your JPEG. You can also choose different formats if you need, and save it. Let be in my users directory. Just go and have a look there. See, I have a few other diagrams from before. Here it comes. View it. Looks quite okayish, not bad quality, quite meaningful if you put it in a real case scenario. You can paste it in a blog, you can have it on your architecture documentation, in Confluence, in Word document, however you structure your architecture repository. One of the interesting things that we have said is about the elements. So you can see all of your elements are now in the motivation layer. If we happen to add a new view, these elements should also be reusable in the new view. You can add a new view, for example, to map the motivation layer to the implementation and see which work packages are going to implement which goals. One of the elements we have overlooked in this example is the outcome. And let's revisit the documentation on outcome once more. So a goal represents a high-level statement of intent, direction, or desired end state for an organization and its stakeholders. An outcome, on the other hand, represents an end result, effect, or consequence of a certain state of affairs. So the outcome is more specific, more concrete. It's, for example, even more quantitative, time related, as you can see here. Unfortunately, I don't have an example at the top of my head which I can say this. Here is an example. You can see goals and outcomes. So the goal is to improve profitability of service offering. You can see the outcome here is very specific, very concrete. It says we increased the profit by 10%. So if we map it back to our example, here we say higher revenue. We can add, for the sake of example, one outcome to see how it complements it. So an outcome, that's coming from having new KYC tools or a higher revenue. We could say 10% revenue increase. It could be higher revenue through other means. We could say we have increased the revenue, we have reduced the cost of packaging, we have reduced our transport ways to the customers. So the outcome here is a very concrete and very specific way of realizing you can see even the relationship between an outcome and the goal is a realization relationship. So in our example use case, this could fit in between the goal and the requirement quite nicely, and again this would be directed in this direction if that's the way we want to model it at the end of the day. Again, now it becomes really annoying with the arrows. That's why I will just redraw it. It's a realization relationship anyways. Here we are. So this quite complements our example use case. With this introduction of the motivation layer, introducing the ArchiMate tool, we have seen different elements of the motivation layer, how to fit them in a real use case to map and model the different stakeholders, their drivers, what are the factors affecting their decisions, what are the outcomes and goals they are aspiring to, what are the principles that are guidelining their actions, and how are we going to measure the success of these specific goals or requirements that will be implemented in later stages of the ADM. We also seen the requirements and the constraints that are deprecated in version 4. We have seen the meanings and the value. I hope this will motivate you to take a look at the open group. In the open group library, the different specifications of the ArchiMate model are also available, mostly for free. This should be a good starting point to have you on Rails with ArchiMate. Thank you and see you in future sessions.